Sometimes, international politics seems like it was written by a slightly crazy screenwriter. Because of course, imagine this. The story of a president who boosted his career by accusing China of manipulating currencies, stealing jobs, and poisoning the United States, and who later desperately needs the Communist Party's help to save thousands of American lives. It could be the plot of a Netflix series. But no, this is happening in real life, and it's happening right now. Donald Trump, the same man who imposed tariffs of more than 120% on Chinese imports, is now embracing a kind of truce with Xi Jinping to attack on many fronts. One particularly sensitive front is fentanyl, a synthetic, cheap, and lethal drug that has caused a veritable silent massacre in the United States. And I'm not exaggerating. In the last decade, opioids such as fentanyl have killed more than 500,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's almost like repeating the atomic bombing of Nagasaki every year. But okay, having said that, I suppose some of you are wondering, but why Xi Jinping? What does he have to do with all this? Well, you see, although 96% of the fentanyl seized by Washington is seized at the Mexican border, which is its main source, in order to manufacture it, you need chemicals known as precursors. And the main global exporter of these ingredients is, that's right, the People's Republic of China. That's why Trump and Xi Jinping reached an unusual agreement when they met a few days ago in South Korea. What does it consist of? Basically, China will suspend the shipment of certain chemicals to North America and will much more closely control exports of these potential precursors to the rest of the world. However, the details of precisely how they will do this are not yet known. But for now, Trump is going to reduce the additional 20% tariff he imposed on China over the fentanyl issue by half, starting November 10th.
Trump tries old tactic with China on fentanyl, a new working group.
Trump not only wants results, he needs them now. With the midterm elections looming on the horizon, his crusade against drugs must become a trophy, one that sets him apart from his predecessors and rescues his narrative. To be fair, this is not exactly new. There was already a working group to address this issue during the Biden administration, a group that Trump dissolved when he returned to power, saying it was useless. Be that as it may, the fact is that the drug issue is one of the most difficult for Trump to tackle, which is not surprising because it is a complex issue for this administration and for previous ones, because this war is not exactly new.
All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs.
To stop drugs at the border, the way we are doing at the Miami Customs Office, where technology and street smarts are catching more drugs.
It's important to recognize that today we are seeing more people killed because of opioid overdose than traffic accidents.
That is why, effective today, my administration is officially declaring the opioid crisis a national public health emergency under federal law.
It's like constant deja vu. In fact, some point out the military deployment in the Caribbean threatening Maduro and drug trafficking is so large and conspicuous precisely due to this. Because Trump needs to convey the idea that he is fighting harder than all his predecessors, including himself, and that this time he's using all means to confront drug traffickers. This was one of his main talking points during his campaign. But guess what? There's a problem. The United States is the greatest military and technological power on the planet, but it's still unable to stop a poison that crosses borders, evades controls, and sneaks into even the most unlikely suburbs. Whether they want to accept it or not, the US has endured 5 decades of consecutive defeats against drug traffickers, and that's precisely why here on VisualPolitik, we have asked ourselves some questions. How could it be that this problem remains unresolved for Uncle Sam? Is it all the fault of the foreign cartels? What are the internal factors that have plunged the US into this crisis? Why have all governments failed to stop this scourge? What if there's something else underlying the issue that no one in the Oval Office has been able to see? Well, we're going to tell you all about this and more right now, but before we get into it, now is the perfect time to subscribe to our channel. Almost half of you who watch us are still not subscribed. How can that be? If you like this video, click the subscribe button now. It's quick, it'll help you not miss any videos like this, and you'll be supporting us out a lot. And now with that said, let's get started. I'm sure many of you remember those movies from the 90s, where everything revolved around the same thing: cocaine, speedboats, and gangsters with open shirts in the style of Pablo Escobar. Oh yeah. The history of addiction in the United States has at least two major chapters. The first is almost mythical. Dozens of South American cartels, led by the Medellin cartel, planting, processing, and shipping massive amounts of white powder to the north. What many people didn't know was that this was only the tip of the iceberg, and that the worst was yet to come. What is happening today with fentanyl is different, even though consumption patterns in the United States are repeating themselves. To begin with, cocaine originates from a plant. This involves open-air crops, covering entire hectares, which can therefore be detected and combated with relative ease. Furthermore, moving cocaine on a large scale requires an entire infrastructure, controlled territories, dozens of people, air and sea routes. In short, large areas controlled by drug traffickers, and a lot of equipment. It's no coincidence that the major cartels of the 1980s and 1990s were considered a transnational threat, even before Islamic terrorism took their place. And curiously, there was no disagreement on this point. Both Democrats and Republicans were clear about it. The difference is that the numbers from that first chapter of history don't even come close to today's figures. Between the 1980s and the 1990s, the average number of overdose deaths was around 6,000 per year, and today it's more than 10 times that. Because the biggest disaster began with the explosion of synthetic opioids. It was like lighting a match in a dry forest, a perfect storm that even the most pessimistic could not have anticipated. Cocaine had already laid the groundwork, millions of users, trafficking structures, and distribution networks. But fentanyl has taken all of that to another level, a much more lethal one. And here comes the big question. How does the crisis of the 1980s differ from the current one? Are they part of the same story? Or are we talking about two completely different worlds? Why has the United States failed to break this spiral of addiction? Well, pay attention, because although foreign cartels are always cast as the villains, and they are, the uncomfortable truth is that this disaster is also a Made in America problem. And why? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at next.
Sleeping with the enemy.
There's one question hanging in the air that, although it sounds simple, is not nonsense. If fentanyl and opioids are so dangerous, so addictive, and so cheap to produce, why on earth is only the United States at the epicenter of this crisis? Because clearly we're talking about substances that can easily cross any border. So what is stopping them from also ravaging Latin America, Europe, or Asia? What's so special about the United States that it has become the main battleground for this epidemic? Because let's not forget that many of these countries, especially in Latin America, are much closer to the centers of production. So how is it possible that something so destructive and cheap has not ravaged them first? Well, here comes the uncomfortable point, one that is rarely discussed, and when it is done so in a half-hearted manner. The fact is, there's no escape. The United States is not only the world's largest economy, it's also, by a wide margin, the largest consumer of drugs in the developed world. And that is largely a local problem, a problem of its own making. The US has almost twice as many people with drug use problems as China or India, even though the latter two countries have almost 5 times the population. In fact, the rate of drug abuse deaths in the United States is around 30 people per 100,000 inhabitants. And this is where many pieces start to fall into place. Because you can have all the Pablo Escobars in the world in your prisons. You can declare war on cartels, narco regimes, and corrupt regimes. But when it comes to illegal drugs, the real problem is consumption, and that's happening at home. That's why the war on drugs has been failing for decades. Think about it for a moment. If you were a drug trafficker, wouldn't it be easier to distribute fentanyl in countries with fewer controls, less surveillance, fewer police, and fewer radars? If cartels are willing to take on the most powerful country in the world and invest millions in logistics, bribes, and technology, it's because supplying the US market is extremely lucrative. No other society on the planet consumes what the United States does. And that changes everything, because no matter how many drug boats sink in the Caribbean, or how many tunnels are discovered at the border, the problem won't go away as long as demand remains intact. And here comes the key twist. Is it possible to reduce that demand? Because that, right there, is the crux of the matter. Massive opioid consumption is not just an accident or an inevitable consequence. For years, it's been promoted from within the system itself. Yes, promoted. You heard me correctly. And that's where the story of a toxic alliance begins. One that has left us with the biggest public health problem in the history of the United States. Pay attention. You see, it all started in 1995. That year, Purdue Pharma launched a new oxycodone formula, an extended-release version with a name that would become infamous, OxyContin. In theory, it was a revolutionary drug designed to relieve the most intense pain, even in terminal patients. In practice, it was a perfect gateway to hell. Technically, OxyContin, although less potent, works in a very similar way to fentanyl. Both are synthetic or semi-synthetic opioid analgesics. Both bind to the same brain receptors, and both, of course, can be addictive in many cases. But the big problem was not just their potency, but how they were sold. It's what many experts describe as one of the greatest tragedies in US public health, as great as the commercial success of the advertising campaigns.
Some patients may be afraid of taking opioids because they're perceived as too strong or addictive, but that is far from actual fact. Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted, and any drowsiness that might occur when you start to take the medication will soon wear off in most patients.
Purdue Pharma managed to persuade a lot of good people in medicine that they needed to dramatically up their prescriptions of opioids.
Purdue, and then dozens of other pharmaceutical companies, launched aggressive campaigns to convince doctors, hospitals, and patients that these opioids were completely safe, that they were not addictive, that they were the ideal solution for chronic pain. But, spoiler alert, they weren't. Many doctors sounded the alarm from the beginning. Anyone with even minimal training knew that opioids can be addictive, even under strict supervision, but the worst was yet to come. A war within the federal government itself. On one side, the DEA warned about the uncontrolled increase in prescriptions and the risks of abuse, and on the other hand, the FDA granting licenses, approving drugs, and letting the party continue with almost irresponsible joy.
The company's aggressive methods, calculated fueling of demand, and grasp for major market share greatly exacerbated OxyContin's widespread abuse and diversion.
Several pharmaceutical companies came to the defense of these painkillers, accusing critical doctors of suffering from opioid phobia. Yes, just like that. Companies like Purdue Pharma not only funded dozens of biased studies, they also created an incentive system that bordered on criminal. The more opioids you prescribed, the more bonuses you got. The result was an explosion. Between 1999 and 2016, opioid prescriptions quadrupled. Meanwhile, the industry's advertising spending reached $6 billion a year. Well, to give you an idea of what we're talking about, today, we know that about 55% of people who received a prescription for opioids and did not consume them exactly as prescribed ended up developing an addiction. It's almost like giving a monkey a gun at a fair. It may not shoot, but if it decides to, and here's the crucial factor, in a matter of a decade, what began as a medical treatment that should be reserved only for patients in extreme pain ended up being something very different. The pathway to the most serious health disaster the United States has experienced in peacetime. VisualPolitik community. If we compare it to the cocaine crisis of the 1980s, there's a huge difference. Cocaine is a more or less natural drug. Don't get me wrong, although it's often cut with truly dodgy additives, the truth is that, as I said earlier, it requires crops, specific climates, and in general, a very visible production process. Fentanyl, on the other hand, can be manufactured in a garage. With sufficient knowledge and access to chemical precursors, it's not that complicated. In other words, it's very cheap, very powerful, and yields enormous profits for traffickers. From a chemical point of view, fentanyl is similar to morphine, and was originally designed as a hospital anesthetic for serious cases. But its structure is so malleable that, with a small variation, you can multiply its potency or make it last longer in the body. And that means one thing: you no longer need plantations, drug boats, or light aircraft. All you need is a few grams of chemical precursors and a clandestine laboratory to produce thousands or even millions of doses. To give you an idea, a quantity of fentanyl the size of a penny can kill 10 people. That's how powerful, profitable, and lethal this poison is. We're talking about the most dangerous and cheapest drug to be produced in modern history. And yet, the United States has fallen into such a brutal spiral of addiction. Why? Because only the United States decided to open the door wide. While most countries, even the poorest ones, have severely restricted the use of opioids, in the United States they were promoted by the offices of some irresponsible pharmaceutical companies and with the inaction, or rather the complicity, of regulatory agencies. Colombia, Venezuela, India, even China, despite Washington's accusations that they are epicenters of drug trafficking, do not face similar internal crises with consumption. They act as producers or intermediaries, yes, but their populations have not been ravaged by opioids. Even those countries have taken certain precautions. But in the United States, the combination of lobbying, greed, incompetence, and political negligence left the way open. And the hardest part is this. We aren't talking about drugs that came through dark alleys or street dealers. No, many of the victims of this crisis began their journey with an official prescription. A prescription signed by doctors and clearly legal. In short, the drug problem in the United States has two sides. The supply, yes, is in the hands of organized crime, but demand was triggered by the system itself. And that's where Uncle Sam shot himself in the foot. So what has the country done since then? Well, mostly blamed outsiders. And yes, in recent years, opioid prescriptions filled at pharmacies are falling sharply, from 260 million in 2012 to less than half that in 2023. This, of course, has not happened by chance, but due to everything we're telling you. And take note, because even so, the levels are still excessive. However, the main narrative is that the problem comes entirely from outside, and that it could be solved with more force, more walls, and more raids. It's a crusade that has been going on for half a century, and battle after battle continues to be lost. And remember, I'm not saying that the fight against drug trafficking is wrong, quite the contrary. States have an obligation to stop any attempt to flood their streets with drugs that destroy lives. The problem is something else. The problem is that the culture of consuming and using very strong drugs very lightly is still ingrained in US society and in its healthcare system. We could even say that a sinister culture of acceptance has been created and spread throughout the country. If you have money, why not use drugs? And then, of course, opioids arrived and everything exploded. This is something that they have attempted to address for years, but it's much more complex than it seems at first glance.
It's taken the first steps of an ambitious public-private partnership with pharmaceutical companies to develop non-addictive painkillers and new treatments for addiction and overdose. So important.
Both the Republican and Democratic parties have promised to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to abandon opioids as the basis for their painkillers, but in practice, so far, it's been mostly talk. Yes, it's true, as I said a moment ago, that prescriptions have fallen significantly in recent years, but that does not mean that opioids have disappeared. Far from it. They continue to move around with absolute ease within the US's pharmaceutical companies, as if nothing had happened, or at least nothing as serious as the tens of thousands of deaths each year. And yes, some laboratories have paid fines. Purdue Pharma, for example, had to pay billions for its aggressive and misleading marketing campaigns, but the damage has already been done.
All 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia and U.S. territories, have approved a $7.4 billion settlement with Purdue Pharma, maker of OxyContin, over the company's improper marketing of opioids.
And let's be clear, no fine, no matter how large, can compensate for the greatest tragedy the United States has experienced since the Civil War. But do you know what is most scandalous? Until not so long ago, fentanyl was not even on the permanent list of dangerous substances regulated by the federal government.
Trump signs Halt Fentanyl Act, reclassifies opioid as Schedule I drug. The bill places all fentanyl-related copycat drugs into the government's most highly restrictive category of banned substances. The legislation does not affect fentanyl when used for medical purposes.
However, amid all this chaos, there is finally a figure that brings some relief. In 2025, overdose deaths have fallen by 20%. A respite in the midst of the fire. And the question is, why? Well, it seems that there are two factors behind this decline. On one hand, tougher border controls are beginning to show results. Although consumption remains very high, there is less and less pure fentanyl in circulation. This forces distributors to mix it or replace it with milder and less lethal substances. Keep in mind, this doesn't mean that there are fewer addicts. It means that the doses are less lethal, as was the case in the 1980s. Then there's the other key factor, naloxone. This drug can reverse an overdose in a matter of seconds. It can practically resuscitate someone who is already on the verge of death. And now comes the supreme irony. It has been easier to obtain a medicine to counteract the effects of fentanyl than to get them to stop producing it. Yes, VisualPolitik community, the cartels are a real threat. They are practically parallel states, criminal economies that destabilize entire regions. That is not in dispute. But the big mistake has been to look only outward. Uncle Sam's arsenal has more than enough power to destroy every drug shipment on the face of the earth. The question lies elsewhere. Will he have the courage to look in the mirror? Because here we have to be blunt. The pharmaceutical companies and the lawmakers who supported them for decades are also largely responsible for the problem, not just the drug lords. And as long as the country continues to ignore this, every anti-drug operation will be nothing more than a bandage. Yet another bandage on a wound that continues to bleed. Because as long as the United States remains a goldmine for drug trafficking, this epidemic will only change its face, its name or its substance, but it will still be there. But for now, it's your turn. Do you think the United States is ready to take its share of the blame? Will fentanyl be just another narcotic that will go out of fashion? Or are we facing an epidemic that will forever mark an entire generation? Leave us your opinion in the comments, because this is going to be a long haul. And very importantly, if you like this video, hit the like button, and of course, subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already. Thank you so very much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.